So, Bloodrayne was a mostly competent action game with some neat ideas, some fun combat, and a charming goth aesthetic, but it was held back largely by fairly shallow combat and nothing story, and some of the most hilarious jank I've seen in a game in a long time. It wasn't the best game of 2002, although it was the best vampire game of 2002, but I had my fun, and I don't really regret my time with it at all, and enough people must have bought it because shortly thereafter, development began on a sequel. In the time between games, Rain herself had a brief stint as a bit of a video game icon. I mean, the reason for this is obvious, she's a hot vampire chick, and the Vampire Freaks crowd ate that shit up. Trust me, I was there. Rain wasn't the first female video game character that was marketed based on her sex appeal, and she definitely wouldn't be the last, but she does have one potentially dubious distinction. On October 2004, a month before the release of Bloodrayne 2, Rain appeared in Playboy magazine, showing the world that video games weren't excluded from magazines you're too embarrassed to buy in person. The marketing campaign for Bloodrayne 2 focused on the game's graphic violence and, you guessed it, tits. And some butt as well, to be fair. Bloodrayne 2 promised to be everything the first game was, but more. More blood, more explosions, more boob. Did it live up to those expectations? Well, let's find out. Hey, I'm Heather, and welcome to the Bloodrayne Retrospective. Okay, so before I get started, I want to give an apology in the previous video. I cannot believe I forgot Creole was a thing. Genuinely, this is fairly embarrassing and I feel like a bit of a dumb bitch. I also wholeheartedly apologise for referring to it as butchered French. That's probably not okay. I'm sorry, I'm a dumb bitch. Bloodrayne 2 is a 2004 action game developed by Terminal Reality and published by Majesco Entertainment in North America and THQ in Europe. Made up of a mostly new team apart from the ongoing composer Kyle Richards, Bloodrayne 2 set out to do everything its predecessor did but better. Upon release, it fared slightly worse than the first game, just barely scoring a 17 Metacritic, with critics at the time praising the graphics and the cathartic violence, while many derided the story and the overall lack of replay value. I'm not gonna lie, Bloodrayne 2 was the game I thought Bloodrayne 1 was. Whenever I had memories of seeing a Bloodrayne game, it was always this one. Something about the art direction of Bloodrayne 2 stood out to me as a kid, but of course I never actually played it until now. Which makes so much sense, like, this game is not for kids and should not be played by kids. But god, I would have eaten this shit up when I was a teenager. Bloodrayne 2 makes a glitchy first impression. Listen, I don't want to turn into fucking Total Biscuit or whatever, but I really do need to go over this game's technical issues. Mostly to do with the audio. This is a bug that has been mostly fixed now, but for the longest time, every time I opened up Bloodrayne 2, it would have everything completely muted. Even when I saved the settings before exiting, it would just always load up with all the settings down to 0. Thankfully this has mostly been fixed, but the game does have some serious audio balancing issues. The transition from in-engine cutscenes to FMV cutscenes is enough to trigger a heart attack. Also, please, for the love of God, Terminal Reality, just add mouse support for the game. I'm literally begging you at this point. This was literally released in 2004. Do you know what else was released in 2004 and had full mouse support in the menus? All of these. Seriously, if I encounter one more game without mouse support, my copy of Destiny is going to be in pieces and it's all Terminal Reality's fault. Bloodrayne 2 is set some 70 years after the events of Bloodrayne 1. With Rain now a full-time agent of the Brimstone Society, the game opens with this FMV cutscene that's aged about as well as I'm Widdicombe. It feels a bit unfair to make fun of FMV cutscenes since they were pretty cool at the time, and pretty much no FMV cutscene from the 90s or early 2000s has survived the Uncanny Valley. It's not quite as Leon S. Kennedy's Doctor Who CGI vibes though. The in-engine cutscenes look nice enough. Anyway, Rain is in the back of a limo with her handler, or I guess her partner, Severin, another agent of the Brimstone Society. Rain pretty much has constant contact with Severin, who will give us helpful information throughout the run. Having actually established characters that stay with us throughout the whole game feels a lot better than whatever the fuck Minds was in the original. Speaking of the original, you could really not find two environments that are more different than the opening levels of Bloodrayne 1 and Bloodrayne 2. Bloodrayne 1 started in the bayou where everything was flooded and every building was falling apart. Real dark and dingy stuff. Bloodrayne 2, on the other hand, opts for the high society vibe. We're basically a party full of Tories, and this is where we find improvement number 1 over Bloodrayne. The graphics. Bloodrayne 2 wasn't setting anyone's world on fire in the graphics department, even back in 2004, but it's still a marked improvement over the original game. Rain herself is nicely stylized, and we go through some really beautiful environments, and all of them are really well realised. Facial animations are a little better too, which is nice to see. Overall, there is less jank with the graphics, but that said, the game has its fair share of oddities, even in the 2020 remaster. Oh yeah, wait, let's talk about the remaster. So yeah, this is the Terminal Cut edition of Bloodrayne 2. Somehow in the first part of this series I didn't quite realise that Terminal was a sort of pun on Terminal Reality and Director's Cut. So we can safely say that I'm a dumb bitch and write it off. I haven't played the original version of Bloodrayne 2 on consoles, but from what I gathered this is basically just a sexed up version of the PC port released in 2004. So it's basically everything I want from a remaster. It runs at higher resolutions, has a relauncher so you can iron out some settings, and if you're playing on Steam it has built-in support for PS4 controllers, which is a godsend. Shame about the fucking mouse, am I right lads? Anyway, it turns out that, just like in real life, this Tory party is actually a vampire party, and we quickly get into cutting dudes up because we're here to kill a fella called Daryl Zirinsky. More on him and the rest of the storyline silliness in the spoiler section, but I will say that it's an improvement over the plot of Bloodrayne 1 in the sense that we actually have an active goal to achieve, and people we need dead, and Rain has many new ways to do so. So improvement number 2 over the original is the hand-to-hand combat. Like, holy shit, did they listen? My main criticism of the combat in Bloodrayne 1 is that it felt floaty and awkward and, well, kinda shit, all things considered. Combat felt weightless when compared to its counterparts like Devil May Cry. You can tell Terminal Reality really took these criticisms of Bloodrayne 1 to heart because the combat has been completely overhauled. First off, we have a lock-on system. Welcome to 1998, my dudes. But let me just be clear, it's not a great lock-on system, and it's inconsistent at the best of times. But it's still miles better than the mess that was Bloodrayne 1. Because of this, combat feels far smoother and more deliberate, rather than feeling like I'm just hammering the mouse button. Rain has an assortment of attacks with her now iconic blades, and she actually has combos this time. While combat still feels floaty and kinda lacking in weight, there is a real depth to this combat that I kinda feel goes overlooked. On top of her melee blade attack, she also has some other tricks up her sleeve, including the ability to kick. Kicking and slicing pulls off unique combos, and kicks work really well with disarming enemies with two-handed melee weapons. These enemies are real spanners in the gears of this combat system, because trying to feed on them will result in you being heavily punished, meaning you have to disarm them, try and flank them, or just throw them about the gap with your cool new grappling hook. And like, lads, this grappling hook is my favourite thing in the fucking world. Not because it's awesome, even though it is kinda awesome, but because it's so daft. You see, Bloodrayne has a physics system now, and enemies will ragdoll all over the place, and objects in the world can be broken, often with far the fuck too loud sound effects. And this grappling hook is the source of so much of this world's joy because of how silly it makes these physics look. Rain can grapple just about any enemy in the world and throw them about, crashing them into walls, impaling them on spikes, or using them as fodder to solve little environmental puzzles. You'll encounter rooms with an obstacle that can only be overcome by throwing enemies into it, and this is so unintentionally hilarious. Towards the end of the game, there's one where you need to throw enemies onto these spikes and then they're launched into the furnace, but the game doesn't automatically put them in the furnace. You're at the mercy of the physics engine, and given that every time an enemy is launched from the spike they enter slow motion, I got enough footage of this being dumb as fuck to fill up several hard drives. It is wonderful, 10 out of 10, better than the gravity gun. And that unintentional humour is often contrasted with the really excessive gore in Bloodrayne 2. Like, Jesus Christ, why? Blood just sprays like water out of a fountain, and it is awesome, I can't deny it. I'm a dumb, bloodthirsty, gorehound bitch. I love The Thing, I love Hostel, I love that one fight scene in Kill Bill, it's all just great. You'll never convince me otherwise. I mean, of course the gore in Bloodrayne is juvenile, it's Bloodrayne. It knows its audience. It knows we're all eternally 14-year-olds on the inside, and Spike was the better match for Buffy, he changed for her, Angel is just a broody piece of shit. Being a vampire, Rain will need to feed on her enemies to restore health, and this brings you back to the best thing about Bloodrayne 1's combat, the fact that not only was it chaotic, but you always had a lot of plates to spin. Choosing when to feed, when to attack, and when to shoot meant there was always a lot of split-second decisions made in the heat of battle. And in Bloodrayne 2, you have even more at your disposal. Feeding still remains the optimal strategy here, since you can use your victims as a meat shield to block incoming fire, although it does leave you exposed from behind. Plus, now we get some cool fatality moves that range from, yeah, fair enough, to holy fuck, get a therapist. They're all really well animated too, and it makes the combat in Bloodrayne 2 feel even more chaotic than the first, while providing you even more choices than you had before. You'll need to manage your health while also keeping up your rage bar while disarming enemies and throwing them aside to stun them. It's good stuff. One part of the combat I'm less enthused by is the changes they've made to the firearms. Bloodrayne 1 often felt like a run and gun shooter with its variety of weapons and arcadey shooting mechanics. This was a bit shit, but it did get the job done. And Bloodrayne 2 gave this a severe overhaul. You no longer pick up guns on the ground, instead Rain has these two guns called the Dragons, and they run on blood, which means you'll have a very limited amount of ammo before you need to feed and replenish it, and failing to do so will result in you taking damage with every bullet fired. What makes this interesting is that you'll have to choose between whether to feed to restore your health and feeding to restore your ammunition. This in theory is actually pretty great, and in practice it's really cool too, but it honestly just made me not use the guns as much as I probably should have. This change does make combat more dynamic, especially since your guns upgrade to function as a pistol, SMG, shotgun, rocket launcher, all of which you can cycle through with ease. But there is one thing that more or less breaks Bloodrayne 2's combat, and the first one as well: feeding. So as I mentioned before, Rain's blood meter acts as her health meter, and it can be refilled at any point by feeding on enemies. This, in reality, means that actually fighting enemies becomes way too risky, especially since the game throws quite a few enemies at you at a time, sometimes with weapons that can take a fair chunk of your health off with just a few hits. So it makes sense to feed on pretty much every enemy you come across so you can start the next encounter with full HP. Most enemies can be fed upon without any resistance, and the ones that do resist can be fed upon anyway if you just dodge roll to their back and then feed. Plus, once you've activated the feeding animation, the enemy is dead. No matter if you drain their blood fully or you decide to just kick them away, meaning that feeding is effectively a one-hit kill. Of course, you could just decide not to do this and kneecap yourself, but I don't know why you would do that because despite all the improvements of the combat system, Bloodrayne 2 still just doesn't feel as tight as Devil May Cry or God of War. With that said though, it's still a clear improvement. It didn't feel like it at first though. In fact, I kinda hated these combat changes for the first couple of hours of gameplay. I felt like it was too complex and the entire thing just seemed janky. Then I realised that's because I was playing with a mouse and keyboard. Yeah, just use the gamepad for this one, it feels infinitely better. Once I decided to just use a PS4 controller, the whole thing just kinda clicked and I started actually having fun. I'm sure some people prefer the mouse and keyboard still and that's fine, it just wasn't for me. It was fine in Bloodrayne 1, when maneuverability was less of an issue, because in the sequel Rain is far more agile than before. So, do you remember in the first part of the video when I said,
"It feels like there's a lot of potential with platforming as a vampire. I mean, Soul Reaver did it well. Maybe Bloodrayne 2 does it better?"
Well, what do you know? Those cheeky bastards watched my video 17 years after in advance. Bloodrayne 2 features some brand new parkour and platforming mechanics, and these are great. It adds a fair bit of variety to the moment-to-moment gameplay, and it actually complements the combat from time to time. Rain can now slide down rails and hold out her blades to slice enemies as she slides. She can also climb poles, swing on poles, and wait a minute. Bloodrayne's combat clearly draws inspiration from Sands of Time, and I want to clarify that this is not a bad thing by any stretch. If you're gonna rip off anything, rip off Sands of Time. It's one of the best games ever made. The less said about the Metal Thong sequel, the better though. All of these improvements to Bloodrayne 2's basic gameplay mean we have a game that is far more refined than the original, and far more fun in the moment to moment. It uses its individual parts well in a way that makes them all come together into one cohesive whole, giving the player lots of options to deal with any scenario. There are also slidey pipe sections, which is neat. You really do get the feeling that you're playing as a vampire here as well. There are levels where you need to avoid standing in water, or you'll have to navigate streets by standing in the shade, and those are really nice touches. The soundtrack is pretty great too, although it's not quite as good as the original. So, is Bloodrayne 2 a good game? I mean, I wouldn't go that far. It's fine, like, by the standards of the time, this is a fairly competent action game with a clear sense of style and enough gameplay variety to keep you entertained for a few hours. But in a year's jam-packed with excellent games as 2004, you probably had better things to do with your time. Bloodrayne 2 isn't a great game, but it's also not a bad game. It's a mid-market PS2 era game with a clear identity, which really I'm fine with. I had a fair bit of fun with Bloodrayne 2 despite all its faults. If you see it on sale, pick it up, but bear in mind you are buying a janky PS2 game from 2004. Okay, so we're heading to spoiler town now. If you want to avoid spoilers for the mad shit that's to follow, click on the time on screen. Also, if you made it this far, be sure to drop me a like and a subscribe, and tell me what your favourite vampire game is in the comments below. So, some notes on the overall plot of Bloodrayne 2. It's far more expansive than the plot of the original, like I said before. There's more of a consistent cast of characters who we more or less get to know as the story progresses, and we're given more of a reason to care about Rain's quest of revenge. You see, Rain is at this guy's party because she wants to kill all the vampiric children of the man who turned her. We see a flashback to when Rain killed this guy. This is Kagan, and he's a Nazi. Not only is he a Nazi, but he's also an evil vampire who wants to amass a vampire army to take over the world. So yeah, he's a Nazi. Kagan was apparently the vampire equivalent of a dirty shagger because he has turned quite a few people over the years, and once he turns someone he goes about murdering their entire family, which is bad form to say the least. Obviously this is why Rain wants him dead. He killed her mother and now Rain wants to return the favour by murdering all of his children. It's hardly a righteous quest, but honestly his kids are all wankers so it's fine. Avenging the death of a parent inherently carries more emotional weight than Rain heading off to Argentina to avenge her friend who was bored to death. So I consider this an overall improvement in the grand scheme of things. Rain and Severin head to a pub for the classic post-murder piss-up, just in time for a car to come crashing through the wall, trapping Rain inside with a bunch of mooks. These mooks are basically just a bunch of kids from the local skate park that have been enticed with the promise of the embrace if they do Kagan's dirty work. Bloodrayne 2's levels are generally on a smaller scale and more intimate and familiar to the player than the first games. Starting out in a shitty dive bar before progressing through the rooftops and abandoned buildings is far more relatable than an Argentine military base or snowy German castles. It's just kind of a shame that the environments all feel kinda samey after a while. I was really enjoying the city streets, but it feels like these levels go on forever, which is weird because the game is only like 6 hours long. What I did love, however, is the nightclub level. I can't quite pinpoint why, but this feels like such a really cool environment for a vampire game, especially in 2004. We progress through the city streets and we find ourselves having a mini boss fight with the Kestrels. The Kestrels are a group of assassin half-vampires who are sent to kill Rain because they're working for the Kagan cult. Whether or not they're related to Kagan or they're paid by the hour, we don't really know. What I do know is that on my first encounter, these girls absolutely wrecked my shit. This was the moment where I realised I had to take Bloodrayne 2's combat a bit more seriously than I had previously. Just button mashing won't really get you far here, you'll need to strategically use all your abilities to take them down. The game also provides some mooks for you to feed on, which is nice. What isn't nice is the hit detection on these. Now, to be completely fair, I'm not entirely sure if this is a hit detection issue or if the game is just slow at updating the health bar, but you can land clear hits on these enemies and all the other bosses and you won't really see the health bar go down. It's really erratic and it almost feels like a glitch, but it's not a game breaker. After a boss fight in the clock tower, we find ourselves in a sewer level and I am literally begging for death. I'm gonna bitch about sewer levels literally every time I encounter them in games, and considering this is primarily a retro gaming channel, you are shit out of luck. I really do not see the need. As a quick wee jaunt like Resident Evil 4 it's fine, but to spend upwards of an hour or two in these boring as shit areas just feels like cruelty at this point. Thankfully the sewers aren't a maze, but oh my god, I tire of this environment really easily. What perked me up were these guys. Literal suicide bombers. Now on their own that's not that funny, but just you wait. We encounter this monstrosity at the end of the sewer section, and this is the funniest boss fight I've ever encountered in any video game ever. Lads, it's not even close. It's a fairly decent fight, lots of stuff to dodge and there's a tactic you have to follow, but oh my god. What happens is when you pull this lever, which causes the boss to, and I shitteth ye not, summon a suicide bomber from the void, the boss then throws them at you and you have to catch them in midair and throw the suicide bombers back at the boss. It's tennis, but with suicide bombers. This is amazing, I love this. I was actually laughing while playing this to the point where I had to pause the game to just let it out. Tennis, but with suicide bombers. I'm having a great time. This is exactly the kind of dumb shit I played Bloodrayne for. This feels like something a Conqueror's Bad Fur Day and I'm 100% here for it. One of the more interesting parts of Bloodrayne 2 occurs just after we leave the sewers and arrive on the surface. It's daytime, and because of that we need to stay out of the sunlight or our health will deplete. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't like groundbreaking in the slightest, but it plays more into the idea that we are literally a vampire. It would have been easy to set the entire game at night like some other 2004 vampire games I could mention, but they didn't, and I like that a lot. It's nice to see the negative parts of vampirism, and not have it entirely played for cool aesthetics and sex appeal. The fact that vampires can't even walk in the sun becomes a major plot point very soon. Basically the plot starts happening again and it turns out that the children of Kagan have been working on the Shroud, a cloud of blood, I think, that covers the daylight sky and will allow the evil vampires to function in the daylight, essentially meaning they can take over the world and doom humanity to their new vampiric overlords. It's not the most unique or compelling villainous plot, but it is the trick. We climb a tower, get our shit wrecked by one of the few named villains, Feral, one of Rain's sisters, and thwart their plans to build the Shroud by destroying the tower that's creating it. Or so we think. Kagan and his wee pals appear and murder the shit out of Feral for being bad at her job. The one who kills her is Ephemera and she's also one of Rain's sisters. You start to realise at this point that Bloodrayne 2 is basically just one big dysfunctional family feud like Jeremy Kyle but with vampires. And then the unexpected happens. They just made the Shroud happen anyway. We were too late to stop it. And the world literally ends. You get this cutscene where all the vampires come down and wreak havoc in the city below, and the bad guys have more or less won at this point, which is actually pretty nice and not where I thought the plot was going at all. We meet Severin and he's like, okay, so this apocalypse thing is a bit shit. And Rain says, yeah, it's alright, Pisser. And they both decide to go murder Rain's extended family anyway. These next few levels are quite visually interesting if nothing else. They're still bleak and grimy looking, but it's one of the few times where we see some of the greenery in this franchise, and it's significantly better than running around another sewer for 9 years. I quite enjoy it. The enemies here are far tougher than before, and this is where you'll have to start using all your vampiric powers to make much of a dent in them at all. They will usually block your grappling hook shots unless they're weak or you're behind them, so the freeze time ability is much appreciated here. Eventually we catch up to Ephemera and another boss fight begins. During this fight we have to destroy all of these dark gates that make her more or less invulnerable, while also managing ads and not getting hit by her. It's quite frantic and fun, and I appreciate the attempt to make the boss fights more than just enemies with great health bars like in the first game. We reach the tower where Kagan is chilling and we realise that Feral isn't actually dead, she's taken some pride damage, and we call a bit of a truce with her and her army go up and batter Kagan's goons. We see them actually fighting each other and it's kinda cool to see. Although Feral does get shanked by the penultimate boss, so there's not really a redemption arc. The penultimate boss actually stumped me for a while. He's inside this big mech thing and he has a bunch of obvious weak points that you need to take care of. I had some real trouble here because I couldn't figure out how to reliably shoot them. It turns out you use your grappling chain to rip them out, which is pretty nice. Turns out I'm just bad at games. With that dealt with, there's only Kagan left, and he's a complete pushover. Throughout this video I've explained how Bloodrayne 2's boss fights try to differentiate themselves from each other with unique mechanics and an attempt at variety, but Kagan is just some mook with more HP than usual. I guess if you want to do some fucking high school English literary analysis, you could say it's because Kaken isn't actually special. He's just some dickhead, like the other legion of some dickheads you've killed up to this point. But I'm gonna err on the side of uninspired. Rain decapitates our Da, avenging her mother, and Severn points out that we killed the big bad, but the vampire apocalypse is still kinda happening. The shroud is still there, and the vampires are still running around eating people. Severn floats the idea of Rain ruling the world, and she's like, might as well. And then the game ends, setting up a sequel that, as of the time of this video, hasn't happened yet. And that's Bloodrayne 2. Overall, the plot is a big improvement on the first game if nothing else. It's got more engaging combat mechanics, and overall you can tell the team really took the criticisms of the first game to heart. That said, it's still not a great game, all things considered. We do get some unlockables, which is pretty cool. We get some artwork and a bunch of costumes, which I think is great. You get the option to play through the game with Rain's dress in the first level, but this time it comes in black, red, green and blue flavours, and a really pretty one that has dragons on it. It's actually a really nice dress, all things considered. You also get Dark Rain, which is sort of like the Kestrels, but it really looks like Konami once you joined Oedo Tai. Next is Cowgirl Rain, which isn't actually as provocative or skimpy as you might expect. And of course there's the obligatory schoolgirl outfit, because God died. Finally we have the armor set, which is really goofy and I'm a big fan. It's like Ashley's second special outfit in Resident Evil 4. But still, should you play Bloodrayne 2? I mean, maybe? I don't know. It's really hard to judge the Bloodrayne games by modern standards because they really are just such products of their time. These two janky PS2 games were riding high off the success of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the, by this point fading, edgy 2000s goth rock aesthetic. As products of their time, they're fun if unremarkable action games that are a bit cringeworthy by today's standards. But what about in 2004? Before I mentioned that your only real option for vampire games in 2002 were the Soul Reaver games. By 2004 this landscape had shifted somewhat. The two very good Buffy the Vampire Slayer games had been released by now, alongside video game adaptations of Underworld and Van Helsing and the cult classic first-person shooter Nosferatu Wrath of Malachi. But if you waited just over a month after Bloodrayne 2's release, the game would be even harder to justify. In November 2004, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines would be released, and to this day I still think it's not only the best vampire game ever made, but also the greatest RPG of all time. Despite all its flaws, if you want a game where you can play as a vampire, play this one. I'm going to cover Vampire Bloodlines at some point in the future in depth, so I won't give you the review here, but Bloodrayne 2 entered a slightly more saturated market at the time, and it was more or less overshadowed by its peers, and it didn't sell as well as the original. Even today, physical copies of the game can cost you a pretty penny. Bloodrayne 2 is the final 3D game of the series, and it did leave some plot threads hanging, but this wouldn't be the last game in the series, because 7 years later, Bloodrayne Betrayal would release. How is that game? Well, we'll talk about that next time. Hey, thanks so much for watching! If you want to get notified when the next episode of the Bloodrayne Retrospective comes out, be sure to subscribe. Follow me on Twitch where I stream 4 days a week at BantsFerdinand. Follow me on Twitter at BantsFerdinand. I'm Heather, and I'll catch you next time.